The beginning of the alliance. In the late 1930s, the world was sliding toward disaster. Aggression was on the rise, and nations were falling one by one to the forces of tyranny. In Europe, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler expanded relentlessly. Austria was annexed, Czechoslovakia was broken apart, and finally, Poland was invaded, marking the beginning of the Second World War. Winston Churchill, watching events unfold, warned his country, "An appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last." Britain and France had tried appeasement, but by 1939, it was clear it had failed. In Asia, Imperial Japan pushed deep into China, bringing devastation to cities and villages alike. Bombs fell on Shanghai, Nanjing, and countless others, leaving ruins and fire. Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini waged war in Africa, occupying Ethiopia and tightening its grip on the Mediterranean. The democracies watched with growing alarm. If tyranny was to be stopped, it would take more than words. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war, forming the first steps of an alliance, fragile, uncertain, but united by necessity. In 1940, France fell under the Blitzkrieg, the rapid, crushing assault of Nazi forces. Britain stood alone. Churchill rallied his people with words that would echo through history. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." The Battle of Britain followed, fought in the skies, where the Royal Air Force resisted wave after wave of German bombers. By the end, Hitler had failed to gain air superiority, and Britain endured. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw the danger and offered aid through Lend-Lease, sending weapons, food, and supplies to Britain and later to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt told the American people, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The alliance expanded in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin called for help, and the Allies answered. Later that year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into the war. Now, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States stood together against tyranny. The alliance was not built on trust, but on survival. Yet in the face of global darkness, they shared one goal: victory, no matter the cost. United for war, the alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States was born out of necessity. But survival alone would not guarantee victory. To defeat the Axis, they had to coordinate every move, share intelligence, and commit to combined operations on a scale the world had never seen. From the very beginning, disagreements surfaced. Britain, still reeling from the Blitz, pushed for Mediterranean operations. Churchill believed in striking what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. The Soviets, bleeding on the Eastern Front, demanded a second front in the West to relieve pressure. The Americans, new to the fight, aimed for a cross-channel invasion, but needed time to prepare. At the Moscow Conference of 1942, Vyacheslav Molotov, representing Stalin, delivered a blunt message: "Every day without a second front costs thousands of Soviet lives." Churchill countered with caution, warning that a premature invasion could end in disaster. Roosevelt, ever the mediator, reminded them, "We fight not for one nation but for the survival of freedom itself." In late 1943, the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met face-to-face in Tehran. Maps were spread across the table, battle plans drawn in thick pencils, and arguments turned into commitments. It was here that Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of France, was confirmed. Stalin pressed his point: "The sooner we meet in the heart of Europe, the sooner this nightmare ends." Churchill, puffing on his cigar, replied, "And meet we shall, Marshal Stalin, with the thunder of 100 divisions." Roosevelt simply nodded, adding, "Let it be done." The alliance's coordination was not only political, it was logistical. American factories became what Roosevelt had promised: the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, planes, and ships in numbers the Axis could never match. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from German U-boats, while Arctic routes carried supplies to the Soviet port of Murmansk. Propaganda reinforced unity. Posters proclaimed, "United we stand," and films showed British, American, and Soviet soldiers fighting side by side. Churchill told Parliament, "We are but the three musketeers of liberty, and we will not fail." Yet mistrust remained just below the surface. Some in the West feared Soviet expansion after the war. The Soviets suspected the West of delaying action for political gain. But both sides understood, if they broke unity now, Hitler would win. By the end of 1943, the alliance was no longer an idea. It was a living, moving force. Three great powers, different in culture, politics, and ideology, were bound together by one goal: to crush tyranny no matter how long or hard the road. Turning the tide. By 1942 and 1943, the tide of war began to shift. Slowly at first, then with decisive force. The Axis advance, once unstoppable, was meeting fierce resistance on every front. In the East, the Soviet Union, after suffering unimaginable losses, made its stand at Stalingrad. The city, reduced to rubble, became a symbol of defiance. Joseph Stalin issued his famous Order No. 227. Not one step back, and the Red Army obeyed. The battle raged from street to street, building to building. Factories became fortresses, and every floor was fought for in blood. When the Soviet counterattack came in the winter, it encircled the German Sixth Army. For the first time in the war, an entire Nazi field army surrendered. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, struck at El Alamein. Before the attack, Montgomery told his men, "We will fight until we win. There is no other plan." The victory forced Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps into retreat, and within months, Axis forces were driven from Africa entirely. American forces joined the fight in North Africa during Operation Torch. It was the first large-scale joint operation between U.S. and British troops, marking the true beginning of Allied offensives on multiple fronts. At sea, the tide was also turning. The Battle of the Atlantic had long been a deadly struggle against German U-boats. Prime Minister Winston Churchill admitted, "The only thing that ever truly frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." But by 1943, new radar, long-range patrol aircraft, and improved convoy tactics began to crush the submarine threat. In the Pacific, the United States scored critical victories at Midway and Guadalcanal. At Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz told his pilots, "The outcome of this battle will turn on our ability to strike first and strike hard." They did, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and shifting the balance in the Pacific. By late 1943, the Allies had momentum. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, thus opened the door to Italy. Churchill, always dramatic, told the press, "The soft underbelly of Europe has been pierced." Mussolini's regime collapsed and Italy surrendered, though German troops fought on fiercely in the mountains. Every victory fed the next. Supply lines grew stronger, morale soared, and for the first time since the war began, the Allies could see the possibility of total victory. But they also knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The road to victory. By early 1944, the Allies had momentum, but they knew the road to victory would pass through the most dangerous operation of the war. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, would decide the fate of Europe. In countless meetings across London, Washington, and Moscow, maps were spread and arguments sharpened. The question was not if they would invade, but when and where. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, chosen to command the operation, told his staff, "We will accept nothing less than full victory." Churchill pushed for careful planning, warning, "This operation is not the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning." Stalin, impatient for relief on the Eastern Front, urged, Open the second front without delay. My armies are ready to meet you in Germany." In the months before the invasion, the Allies unleashed a massive bombing campaign over France, targeting railways, bridges, and supply depots. American and British bombers filled the skies, while resistance fighters in occupied France prepared to sabotage German lines. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were stormed by British, American, and Canadian forces. Eisenhower, before the landings, told the troops, "The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." The fighting was brutal. At Omaha Beach, waves of men fell under heavy fire, but they kept advancing. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold in Normandy. Churchill announced to Parliament, "The liberation of Europe has begun." As the Allies pushed through France, the Germans were forced into retreat. Paris was liberated in August 1944, greeted by crowds waving flags and cheering in the streets. General Charles de Gaulle declared, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that shattered German Army Group Center. Stalin told his generals, "We will drive them back to Berlin and then beyond." By late 1944, Germany was fighting on both fronts, its cities under constant bombardment, its armies exhausted. Yet Hitler refused to surrender. The Allies knew the final push would be bloody, but the end was now in sight. The fall of the Third Reich. By early 1945, the walls of Nazi Germany were closing in. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine River. From the east, the Soviet Red Army pushed relentlessly through Poland and into Germany itself. Hitler, hidden in his underground Führer bunker in Berlin, refused to face reality. To his generals, he raged, "We will not surrender! We will fight to the last man!" But his empire was already collapsing. In February 1945, the Big Three met at Yalta to plan the final stage of the war and the shape of the world after it. Churchill warned, "The tragedy of Europe cannot be resolved by force alone. But first, we must end this war." Roosevelt, visibly tired but determined, added, "We owe it to the dead and to the living to make sure this never happens again." Stalin simply promised, "The Red Army will be in Berlin." In April 1945, Soviet artillery surrounded the German capital. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army advanced. Shells pounded the city day and night, and the sky over Berlin was filled with smoke and fire. Inside the bunker, Hitler dictated his final will. On April 30th, he took his own life. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels told those around him, "The Führer is dead. The time has come to join him." The Nazi leadership crumbled. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered to the Soviets. Just days later, on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Germany's unconditional surrender was signed. Churchill addressed the British people. "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget the toil and efforts that lie ahead." In America, celebrations erupted, and Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, dedicated the victory to Roosevelt, who had died just weeks earlier. "This is for him, and for all who gave their lives." In Moscow, Stalin addressed his people. "The age-old struggle of the Slavs against the German invaders has ended in victory. Glory to our heroic Red Army." The Third Reich was no more. But even in victory, the Allies looked to the east, where the war in the Pacific still raged. The final blow in the Pacific. While Europe celebrated victory in May 1945, the war in the Pacific still raged on. Japan, though pushed back on all fronts, refused to surrender. From island to island, the Allies had fought their way across the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each battle was fought with ferocity, and each cost thousands of lives. At Iwo Jima, Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. One exhausted soldier whispered, "This means we're still alive and still fighting." By mid-1945, Okinawa had fallen, but the price was staggering. Over 200,000 dead, military and civilian. American commanders knew that invading the Japanese home islands could cost millions more. President Harry Truman faced the most difficult decision of the war. He told his advisors, "We will use every weapon we have to end this war and save American lives." On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, the city was reduced to ash. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more suffered burns and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Japanese survivors spoke in broken voices. "The world has ended, and yet we live." That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, smashing the Japanese Kwantung Army. Facing total destruction, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people for the first time in history. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the Instrument of Surrender. General Douglas MacArthur declared, "We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement. A better world shall emerge from the blood and carnage of the past." The Second World War was over. A war that had consumed the globe for 6 years had finally ended, leaving behind cities in ruins, millions dead, and a world forever changed. Aftermath and legacy. The guns fell silent, but the scars of the Second World War would last for generations. Over 70 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities lay in ruins, from Warsaw to Tokyo. The world was divided. In the West, the United States emerged as a global superpower. In the East, the Soviet Union stood as its rival. The wartime alliance dissolved into suspicion and tension, the beginning of the Cold War. In Germany, the Nuremberg trials brought Nazi leaders to justice. American prosecutor Robert H. Jackson told the court that 4 great nations, flushed with victory, have voluntarily submitted their captured enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. In Japan, a new constitution renounced war. General Douglas MacArthur told the Japanese people, "We are committed to your future as a peaceful and honorable nation." But beyond politics, the human cost was impossible to measure. Millions of families were shattered, millions more displaced. Entire communities were wiped from the map. Winston Churchill reflected in 1946, "In war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill." Yet peace would prove fragile. The lessons of the war were clear to some, that unchecked aggression and tyranny would inevitably lead to catastrophe. But the world, as history would show, often forgets its lessons. The Second World War had reshaped borders, toppled empires, and unleashed the atomic age. It had shown both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. Now the question remains for us, living in the shadow of that history. If the world ever stands again on the brink of such destruction, will we remember what it cost to pull it back?